Welcome to Reformed Thinking. I'm so glad you're joining us today. Today, our mission is a comprehensive deep dive into some truly massive source material.
Hello, everyone. Yes, it is a massive text. We are looking directly at Charles Spurgeon's monumental work, The Treasury of David.
Right. And we are focusing specifically on his extensive commentary, along with the collected historical notes for Psalm 102.
And for you, the listener, we really want to establish our theological framework right out of the gate here.
Yes, absolutely. As Protestant Christians who hold firmly to the Westminster Confession, we approach this text looking through a specific lens.
The Confession teaches that God is infinite in being and perfection. He is most absolute, working all things according to the counsel of his own immutable and most righteous will.
So in this deep dive, we're going to examine how this specific psalm highlights that absolute sovereignty, the unchangeable nature of God, and his magnificent grace. All of this is set against the rather bleak backdrop of extreme human frailty.
It is a remarkable text to examine.
It really is. Spurgeon gives us a wonderful overview of the source text right at the beginning. He outlines the structure of Psalm 102 by comparing its composition to a single shifting day.
That structural comparison is brilliant.
It opens with wind and howling rain, a truly desolate morning. Then it clears up at noon, becoming warm with the sun, and finally it closes with a brilliant, glorious sunset. We will follow that precise progression today.
We are going to step right into the pouring rain of the psalmist's grief. This is not a superficial sadness. The title of the psalm itself marks it as a prayer of the afflicted when he is overwhelmed and pours out his complaint before the Lord.
And Spurgeon notes that this is a prayer far more in spirit than in words. The formal petitions are few, but a strong stream of supplication runs from beginning to end.
It is like an undercurrent finding its way heavenward through the moanings of grief.
I love that image of the undercurrent. It paints a picture of someone who might not even have the right words, but the groan itself is the prayer.
Precisely. One of the classical commentators cited in our material, Finian's Canis Vove, illustrates this by comparing the afflicted soul to a vessel overcharged with new wine that simply bursts for vent.
So there is no lazy, slothful lip labor here.
Not at all. These are poured-out prayers, pressed forth with a vehemence of spirit and inward grief. When you are overwhelmed, when the cup of your life is turned upside down, all that is in it is naturally poured out.
Spurgeon makes a crucial distinction here, though.
Wow.
The word rendered complaint has no fault-finding or repining in it.
Right. It is a moaning, an expression of pain, not of rebellion against God. And that brings us to the core subject of the first half of our deep dive. Spurgeon calls this the patriot's lament, or the patriot's plaint.
The sufferer arrays himself in the griefs of his nation as in a garment of sackcloth. He is afflicted in body, yes, but the miseries of his people cause him a far more bitter anguish.
Which brings us to the physical reality of his suffering.
Okay, let's unpack this. The sheer physical toll of this kind of grief is staggering. Looking at verses 1 through 11, we see visceral bodily reactions to intense sorrow.
The psalmist says his days are consumed like smoke.
And his bones are burned as a hearth. His heart is smitten and withered like grass, so much so that he forgets to eat his bread. I want you, the listener, to consider how spiritual grief often manifests in physical ailments.
We like to compartmentalize our lives, separating the spiritual from the physical, but this text refuses to let you do that. When the soul is crushed, the body follows.
Looking at these verses, it sounds like he is starving himself from sheer grief. Is that just a poetic exaggeration?
No, not at all. In fact, Henry Cowles, a 19th century theologian from our stack of sources, notes that consumed like smoke means his days waste away to nothing. They turn to no good account and are lost. They just vanish.
And then we have Sir Richard Baker, a fascinating 17th century writer. Baker actually spent a significant portion of his life in debtor's prison, so he knew a thing or two about isolation and physical suffering.
He draws out this smoke metaphor beautifully. He says that smoke is a vapor proceeding from the fire, yet it has no heat in it. It is dark, it affords no pleasure to look upon, and it wastes itself in ascending.
When the psalmist says his bones are burned as a hearth, he means all the fuel of life is spent. You are left with the cold, spent ashes.
That is a haunting image. You are just the ashes left behind after the fire has burned through everything you care about.
And the physical devastation continues. The text says his heart is smitten and withered like grass. Adam Clarke, the great British Methodist theologian, explains this by comparing it to grass cut down in the meadow.
First smitten with the scythe, then withered by the sun.
And because of this, he forgets to eat. Sir Richard Baker points out the stark reality of this. Hunger is a prompter that usually makes a man remember his meat in spite of his teeth.
But when the heart is blasted and withered, your body basically goes into shock. Your survival instincts just shut down. Sorrow monopolizes the mind. It draws moisture from the brain to fill the eyes with water, leaving the body parched and the stomach without appetite.
The result is emaciation. Verse 5 says, "By reason of the voice of my groaning, my bones cleave to my skin."
Joseph Carroll, a prominent Puritan minister from the 1600s, bluntly summarizes this. He says, when the bones cleave to the skin, both are near cleaving to the dust. The psalmist has grown himself down to a living skeleton.
It is so intense.
Yeah.
And what strikes me is how this physical breakdown leads directly to this massive sense of social isolation. In verses 6 and 7, he starts comparing himself to birds.
He says he is like a pelican of the wilderness, an owl of the desert, and a sparrow alone upon the housetop.
I have to admit, when I read that, I did not immediately grasp the significance. Why these specific birds?
What's fascinating here is the absolute specificity of the analogies the psalmist uses to describe his resultant isolation. These are not random choices. Let us look at the first one, the pelican of the wilderness.
The naturalist J.G. Wood explains that this bird does not like the neighborhood of human beings.
Right, it resorts to broad, uncultivated lands to make its nest and hatch its young. After gorging itself with food, it sits motionless for hours, its head sunk on its shoulders, its bill resting heavy on its breast, digesting its meal in utter quiet.
W.M. Thompson, a missionary who observed these birds in the Middle East during the 19th century, calls them the most somber, austere birds he ever saw, adding that they gave him the blues just to look at them.
So we should picture a massive, heavy bird sitting entirely motionless in a swamp or a wasteland, totally cut off from the rest of the world.
Yes. The psalmist, weighed down by the heavy burden of his sorrow, identifies with this austere, motionless creature isolated in a desolate place. He feels heavy. He feels stuck.
Then we have the owl of the desert. The Arabic translation for this specific bird, el-Charab, is highly revealing. It means mother of ruins.
Wait, let's pause on that image for a second. The mother of ruins. That is an incredible title. For anyone listening right now who feels like their life or their church or their communities is a pile of rubble, identifying with the mother of ruins is such a striking concept.
It truly is. This owl is an emblem of gloom that dwells among fallen palaces and prostrate temples. The commentator W. Houghton references the Arabic name buma, describing a grotesque, cautious little bird that remains glued to its perch on the spray-beaten fragments of Tyre, or the ruins of ancient cities.
Uttering a low, wailing note at sunset, it makes its home exclusively in the broken places.
Finally, we see the sparrow alone upon the housetop. J.G. Wood clarifies that this is likely not the cheerful, gregarious sparrow we are accustomed to seeing in flocks, fighting over crumbs.
Right. We aren't talking about those hyperactive little sparrows you see in a grocery store parking lot.
Not at all. It is the blue thrush, a solitary bird that refuses to flock. It is fond of sitting on the tops of houses, uttering a monotonous, melancholy song. When it loses its mate, it will sit on the roof alone and lament its sad bereavement by the hour.
The psalmist uses these three specific birds to paint a complete picture of his condition. Austere isolation, dwelling among the ruins of what once was, and singing a solitary, melancholy lament.
That paints a completely different mental picture than just saying, I am sad and lonely.
And if we connect this to the theological angle, we must keep in mind that this is a patriot's plaint. The psalmist is grieving for Zion, the church. He is not just crying over his own personal bank account or his own personal sickness.
True believers are marked by their intense concern for the state of God's church. When the church is in decay, when its walls are broken down by false teaching or moral failure or external persecution, the true saint does not play the peacock with worldly pride.
They become the pelican, the owl, the solitary thrush. They mourn, they eat ashes like bread, as verse 9 says.
Sir Richard Baker points out the bitter irony here. All sin is a kind of surfeit, committed with a design of pleasure, but it inevitably brings 1,000 times more trouble. To cure the mortal disease of sin, the psalmist is placed on this strict diet of eating ashes and mingling his drink with tears.
It is an all-saturating, all-embittering sadness, born out of an intense love for the Lord's people and a clear-eyed view of their desolate condition.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. After 11 verses of unceasing lamentation, where the writer feels like a withered leaf caught up by a hurricane, lifted up only to be dashed to the earth with greater violence, we hit a massive pivot in verse 12.
The text says, "But thou, O Lord, shalt endure forever, and thy remembrance unto all generations." The contrast is absolute. The psalmist looks at his own pining, withered, smoke-like existence and then turns his gaze to the eternal God.
And there's a specific Hebrew translation here that changes everything about how we read this. The original Hebrew word translated as endure is actually the word for sit. It means thou, Jehovah, to eternity shalt sit.
God remains forever seated upon his throne. He is completely sovereign, regardless of the earthly chaos, the ruined cities, or the captive people. This is the very bedrock of Reformed theology. The sovereignty of God in all things is the unfailing ground for consolation.
Because he rules and reigns whatever happens, all is well. You might feel like your life is declining like a shadow, but over all these vanishing shadows, the one eternal, immutable light shines on. He's sitting down. He is not pacing the floors of heaven, wondering what to do next.
That is the perfect way to phrase it. He is not pacing. And this leads directly to a staggering declaration of faith in verse 13. Thou shalt arise and have mercy upon Zion, for the time to favor her, yea, the set time is come.
Notice the absolute certainty. The psalmist prophesies that apparent inaction on God's part will turn to effective working. Zion might be in a low condition. God may hide his face in chastisement for a season to make the church see her poverty apart from him. But in love, he must return.
He has a decreed timing. Stephen Charnock, a towering Puritan divine from the 1600s who wrote extensively on the attributes of God, lays this out brilliantly in his commentary on this text.
What does Charnock say about this set time?
He explains that God has a certain set time for his great actions. He lets the powers of darkness have their hour, but God will take his hour. He has a set time for the discovery of his mercy, and he will not stay a single second beyond it.
When the weeks of captivity in Babylon were fulfilled, no bolts or bars could imprison the ransomed of the Lord. When the set time comes, neither persecutors nor atheists can prevent the kingdom of Christ from extending its bounds.
And Charnock points out something beautiful. That set time often aligns with the moment when the church is most humble, most affectionate to God's interests, and most sincere in her desires.
That sincerity of desire seems to be perfectly illustrated in the very next verse, verse 14. It says, For thy servants take pleasure in her stones, and favor the dust thereof.
On the surface, this is strange imagery. Why would anyone love rubbish and ruins? I mean, dust is what you sweep out of your house, not something you take pleasure in.
It seems counterintuitive until you look at the historical context. The commentator Kitto, in his 19th century work, The Pictorial Bible, provides a moving historical illustration of this reality. He describes the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem.
Worshippers would assemble there, taking off their shoes as if standing on holy ground. They would stand or kneel with their faces toward the massive, ancient stones, which were the only remaining traces of the temple enclosure.
They would gaze in silence or pour forth their complaints in half-suppressed sobs, literally kissing the stones and weeping over the desolations of their holy places. They took pleasure in the stones and favored the dust.
I have seen footage of people at the Western Wall today doing that exact same thing. It is a visceral connection to the past, even when that past is in ruins. How does that apply to us today, particularly within the church?
When applied to the church today, this carries a weighty implication. True believers love the church even when it appears broken, compromised, or in ruins. It is a good omen for any local congregation when its members are intensely interested in all that concerns her.
When they care about the ordinances in the fellowship, even when things look bleak, the poorest church member, the most grievous backslider, should be precious in our sight because they form a part of the New Jerusalem.
Stephen Marshall, a prominent English Puritan, captured this perfectly while preaching a sermon to the House of Peers in 1645.
What was his message to the political leaders of his day?
He told them that the building of Zion infinitely pleases God because Zion is the apple of his eye. He bought Zion at a dear rate with his own blood. He lays Zion in his bosom. Therefore, when God is going to build up Zion, as verse 16 says, he appears in his glory.
He does not put on his mourning apparel, he puts on his glorious apparel. As kings display their skill and wealth in the erection of their capitals, so the Lord reveals the splendor of his attributes in the restoration of Zion.
Internal prosperity within the church, when the saints are edified, instructed, and bound together in Christian love, becomes the true source of external influence. Verse 15 says that when this happens, the heathen shall fear the name of the Lord, and all the kings of the earth his glory.
A quickened church forces from the great ones of the earth, a recognition of divine working. That logic makes total sense. If the church is thriving internally, the outside world cannot help but notice.
But that brings up a question about verse 17. The psalmist says, "He will regard the prayer of the destitute and not despise their prayer."
We just talked about God appearing in his glorious apparel, like a king building a capital city. Usually, when a king is busy with a massive construction project, he did not have time for the peasants. So who specifically are these destitute people the text is talking about?
If we connect this to the bigger picture of the Hebrew language, we get a fascinating insight. We know that during the Babylonian captivity, only the poorest of the people were left among the ruins, while the rest were carried away as strangers in a strange land.
But the Hebrew word used here for destitute has a very specific botanical background. It refers to the Merica shrub.
A shrub, like a bush.
Yes, it is a low, base, wild shrub, like the tamarix or the ratama, that grows only in the desolate, howling, sandy deserts of Arabia. It survives in the harshest conditions imaginable, where the wadis dry up and the sun beats down relentlessly.
It represents someone who is stripped of all comforts, entirely forsaken, like a barren heath in a miserable wilderness.
Stephen Marshall notes that these are folks who have lost their children, their peace, their liberty, and feel utterly forlorn. Yet the text promises that the Lord will regard their prayer.
When great kings are building palaces, you don't expect them to turn aside to listen to a beggar pleading in the street. But when the Lord builds up Zion, when he appears in his robes of glory, he makes it a point to listen to every petition of the poor and needy.
That is a stunning contrast. The King of Glory stopping to listen to the desert shrub. George Bowen, a 19th century missionary to India from our stack of sources, gives us a piercing insight here.
He says that a man who is destitute knows how to pray. He needs no instructor. His miseries indoctrinate him wonderfully in the art of offering prayer.
Bowen contrasts this with a lukewarm church that says, "I am rich and increased in goods and have need of nothing," while remaining blind to its spiritual poverty. You have to know yourself to be destitute of strength, wisdom, and righteousness to offer the prayer that God regards.
And look at verses 19 and 20. They describe God looking down from the heights of his sanctuary, leaning from the high place of his holiness, like a watcher on the battlements of heaven.
I love that phrase, the battlements of heaven.
He is straining to see the earth. But what is he looking for? He is not looking at the grand nobles or the kings of the earth. He is straining to hear the groaning of the prisoner, to loose those that are appointed to death.
God bends down to hear the groans of those in prison, which are usually horrible to hear, and he deigns to stoop from his greatness to relieve their extreme distress.
You know, it is one thing to read that in a poetic psalm. It is another thing to see it play out in history. Has this reliance on the prayer of the destitute ever been tangibly proven?
Absolutely. Stephen Marshall provides a brilliant anecdote from the English Civil War to illustrate this very point. To set the stage, it was 1643. The parliamentary forces, who largely represented the Puritan and Reformed factions, were facing a devastating low point.
The royalist forces, led by Prince Rupert of the Rhine, had just captured the major stronghold of Bristol. The siege was brutal, and the fall of Bristol was a massive strategic and psychological blow to the parliamentarians.
So the people who held to this theology were losing the war. Badly.
Yes, the royalist forces were so confident in their victory that they sent out a triumphant boast. They looked at the shattered remains of their opposition and concluded that all was subdued.
They claimed there was nothing left to conquer the king but the prayers of a few fanatic people. They had taken the cities, melted the armies, and driven out the opposition. Only tears and prayers were left.
They were mocking them. They were basically saying, all you have left is your little prayers?
Precisely. But Marshall highlights the incredible irony of that boast. Prayer was the one thing the enemy could not conquer. They found it the hardest wall to climb and the strongest brigade to overthrow.
God reserved the preservation of the cause to the desperate prayers of the destitute. The parliamentarians eventually turned the tide of the war, not by military might alone, but through the sustaining grace sought in those desperate prayers.
It is a stunning historical validation of verse 17. God will not despise their prayer.
We brought up Sir Richard Baker earlier, the commentator who spent time in debtor's prison. He has an observation here that perfectly sums this up. He uses this Latin legal phrase, in forma pauperis.
That basically means filing a lawsuit when you are too poor to afford the court fees. You are submitting your plea in the form of a pauper.
Baker says it is hard for us to believe because human kings keep their distance from the poor and think it degrades them to look downwards, that the king of the universe would accept a petition written by someone who has absolutely nothing. But with God, he counts it his glory to regard the inglorious.
And because of this marvelous deliverance, verse 18 tells us, this shall be written for the generation to come. and the people which shall be created shall praise the Lord. This points to the absolute necessity of keeping registers of divine kindness.
We write down in history the calamities of nations, wars, famines, pestilences, but we should set up memorials of the Lord's loving kindness. Stephen Marshall observes that the redeemed church takes no thought concerning their own ease or wealth.
Their thoughts are wholly laid out on how succeeding generations should give all glory to God. They know the Lord has reserved his glory for himself, and their highest joy is to ensure that the people yet to be created will know that the Lord God of their fathers is full of compassion.
It is amazing to think of God leaning out of heaven just to hear the poorest of the poor, but that raises a pretty massive question in my mind. If this world is so broken and fleeting, who is this eternal God doing the listening?
Because in verse 23, the tone shifts completely. The psalmist comes back down to his personal complaint. He says, "He weakened my strength in the way. He shortened my days. I said, oh my God, take me not away in the midst of my days."
He feels like a limping pilgrim, ready to lie down and die before he sees the restoration of Jerusalem. But then, right in the middle of this plea for a little more time, he suddenly shifts his focus away from his own shortened days to the eternal days of God, and specifically to the creation of the heavens and the earth.
The transition is abrupt, but intentional. He says, "Thy years are throughout all generations. Of old hast thou laid the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the work of thy hands."
He contrasts his own pining, expiring frame with his God, who lives on in the fullness of strength forever. The commentator Joseph Carroll points out that the phrase, "take me not away," literally means "let me not ascend" in the original text, carrying a double allusion.
It is like corn taken up by the reaper, or a candle that spends its fuel, ascends in smoke, and vanishes. The psalmist is begging not to be snuffed out halfway through his course.
But the comfort he finds is entirely rooted in the unchangeable, eternal nature of the Creator. If the Almighty made a world out of nothing, it will be no labor for him to raise the walls of Zion from their heaps.
He who arched the world with a ceiling of blue can easily pile the loftiest stories of his earthly palace.
This raises an important question. Who is the Creator being addressed in these specific verses? And here we find one of the most magnificent theological revelations in the entire Bible. We don't have to guess because the New Testament tells us explicitly.
I love when Scripture interprets Scripture.
It is the safest way to read the text. In the first chapter of Hebrews, the author takes these exact verses from Psalm 102, verses 25 through 27, and applies them directly to Jesus Christ.
This proves his divine, eternal nature. The afflicted psalmist, in the depths of his Babylonian despair, was actually addressing the eternal Son of God.
Wait, so the guy sitting in the ruins of Jerusalem crying about the stones and the dust is talking to Jesus?
Yes. Thomas Goodwin, a brilliant 17th century Puritan who was a member of the Westminster Assembly and chaplain to Oliver Cromwell, wrote a monumental treatise on the knowledge of God the Father and his Son Jesus Christ.
Goodwin takes this truth from Hebrews 1 and traces the existence of Christ backward through time. It is a breathtaking theological exercise.
Walk us through Goodwin's timeline. How does he trace Christ backward?
Goodwin starts at the Incarnation, noting that Christ had a body prepared for him, meaning he existed before he took on flesh. Then he steps back to John the Baptist, who said, "He that cometh after me is preferred before me, for he was before me."
Right, because Jesus was born after John, but John acknowledges Jesus existed first.
Correct. Then Goodwin steps back to the wilderness wanderings, where the Israelites tempted Christ, as Paul states in his letter to the Corinthians. Then back to Abraham, where Jesus famously declared, "Before Abraham was, I am."
Then back to the days of Noah, where Christ, by his Spirit, preached to the spirits now in prison. Then back to the very beginning of creation as the Word who was with God and was God.
Finally, Goodwin traces Christ all the way back to eternity past, before the foundation of the earth, where his goings forth are from everlasting. The psalmist's comfort in his shortened days is entirely anchored in the everlasting days of the Son of God.
That is an incredible progression. Seeing the eternal Christ in the Old Testament completely changes how you read the Psalms. And this leads to the breathtaking garment metaphor in verse 26.
Speaking of the heavens and the earth, the text says, "They shall perish, but thou shalt endure. Yea, all of them shall wax old like a garment. As a vesture shalt thou change them, and they shall be changed."
John Owen, who is often called the Prince of Puritans and served as the Vice-Chancellor of Oxford University, breaks this down for us in a way that is just staggering.
He says that the whole physical creation is like a garment, wherein the Lord clothes himself to show his might to men. The creation shows the shape of the man, so to speak, but it also hides his full essence. No creature can come to the perfect knowledge of God by simply looking at the physical universe.
Wait, let's pause on that for a second. Think about what that means. The stars, the galaxies, the Rocky Mountains, the Pacific Ocean. Well, all of it is just a coat he is wearing. And one day, he is just going to put it in the closet.
Yes. The universe is wearing out. The laws of thermodynamics tell us that everything is winding down. It is waxing old. And when the time comes, God will simply lay it aside.
He will fold up the stars and the earth like a worn-out vesture as easily as a man takes off an old coat he intends to wear no more. Thomas Adams, an English clergyman from the 1600s, adds that this destruction is not an annihilation, but a change.
A purging of the dross so that all things are restored to their original beauty. But the central point is that while the universe is a disposable garment, the creator wearing it is unalterable.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? It means your salvation is utterly secure. Verse 27 says, "But thou art the same, and thy years shall have no end."
Stephen Charnock explains that God cannot be changed into any other thing than what he is. He is immutable in essence, nature, will, and purpose. He receives no shadow of change. The doctrine of the immutability of God is the bedrock of our peace.
If Christ changed, if his love waxed and waned like the moon, if his decrees were subject to revision based on our performance or the shifting tides of human history, we would have no hope. But because Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever, the believer can rejoice always.
You might lose your dearest earthly friends. Your health might decline like a shadow. The visible church might look like a pile of rubble, and the very stars in the sky might burn out and be folded up like old clothes. But your heavenly friend remains unaltered.
That is the anchor for the soul. And that anchor brings us to the final verse of this deep dive, verse 28. "The children of thy servants shall continue, and their seed shall be established before thee."
Having looked at his own impending death, and then at the eternal nature of Christ, the psalmist now looks forward to the future generation. He finds good cheer in the fact that a race will arise to be preserved and blessed by God.
How do we interpret that promise today? Because from a strictly biological standpoint, we know that faith does not just automatically pass from parent to child, like eye color or height.
We must analyze this final promise through a strict Reformed lens. Thomas Manton, a Puritan clergyman who actually served as a clerk at the Westminster Assembly, provides the necessary theological nuance here.
We know that saving grace is not biologically hereditary. God has no grandchildren in the sense of automatic spiritual inheritance. Each person must be regenerated by the Holy Spirit.
However, God does not neglect the children of his servants. It is the general rule of his covenant dealings that he delights to be worshipped by the same families generation after generation.
Manton has a really unique way of phrasing this, doesn't he?
He does. Manton beautifully describes children as the parents multiplied and a knot tied in the line of time.
A knot tied in the line of time. That is brilliant.
When a father's life runs out, the knot is tied and the line is continued by the child. This is Zion's true hope. Her sons will build her up, her offspring will restore her former glories. God's service is the surest way to establish a family.
This gives a massive weight to the prayers of the afflicted that we discussed earlier. The prayers you offer today, even when poured out from a state of complete destitution, are laying the groundwork for the spiritual vitality of future generations.
The psalmist, sitting in the ruins of Jerusalem, eating ashes and weeping, was actually securing a promise that his seed would be established before the Lord.
That is a staggering reality. To recap the movement of this text, we started in the bleakest rainstorm of personal and national grief, looking at a man whose bones were burning and who felt entirely isolated, like a motionless pelican in the wilderness or an owl sitting in the ruins.
Then we watched the text pivot at noon, realizing that God sits on an eternal throne and has a decreed, set time to favor his people.
We saw how God leans out from the battlements of heaven to hear the groaning of the destitute prisoner, the person who feels like a dried-up desert shrub.
We trace the eternal nature of Christ backward through time, recognizing that the entire physical universe is nothing more than a temporary garment. He will eventually fold up and put away.
And finally, we arrived at a glorious sunset, basking in the secure promise that the children of God's servants will continue and be established. It is an incredible progression from despair to absolute, unshakable confidence in the sovereignty and immutability of God.
Before we sign off, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over, something that builds on this source material. We talked extensively about the physical universe being a garment that God will eventually fold up and replace.
Think about the implications of that for your daily life.
If the vast, seemingly permanent physical universe, the mountains, the oceans, the stars, is just a temporary vesture, how much of your daily anxiety is tied up in the wrinkles of a fabric that isn't meant to last?
We spend so much energy agonizing over the fading threads of this temporary world, while the eternal Creator, who remains the same forever, holds us in an unyielding grip of grace.
That is a brilliant perspective to carry with you.
Thank you for joining us on Reformed Thinking for this deep dive into Psalm 102. As you go about your week, we encourage you to meditate on the pronouns in your own prayers. As Martin Luther noted in our source text, much religion lieth in pronouns. Saying God is one thing, but saying my God is the door through which the King of Saints enters into our hearts with his whole train of delights and comforts. Until next time, keep your eyes on the eternal throne.